Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us today for a discussion of Miriam Udel's new book, Modern Jewish Worldmaking Through Yiddish Children's Literature, available from the YIVO online store. Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University, focusing on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. Udel's academic research and interests include 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, and American Jewish literature. She's the editor and translator of, among a number of books, Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature. And joining us to lead us in this conversation, we're so pleased to have Marjorie Engel. Marjorie Engel is the author of Mamala Knows Best, What Jewish Mothers Do to Raise Successful, Creative, Empathetic, Independent Children, and Sorry, 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 The Case for Good Apologies. She often writes about children's books for the New York Times Book Review, and she has been a columnist for Tablet Magazine and The Forward. Without further ado, I want to thank both of our panelists for joining us and hand the conversation over.
Yay! Miriam, this book is so freaking good. And such an important addition to the conversation, not only about Yiddish and Jewish children's literature, but about children's literature in general. And so I think a great place to start is world making in the title. Tell us more. Why that word? What is world making?
Sure. So before I answer that, I just want to express my gratitude to the YIVO Institute for hosting this webinar and making it at a really inclusive time for friends from all over, and express my gratitude to you, Marjorie, because I have been a fan of East Village Mamala since the time that my eldest child was a very young child. And I feel like you really pointed the way in terms of thinking about and speaking to children as people. And that's very much the spirit in which I wrote this book. It's a spirit that I think is grounded in generations of Jewish and Yiddish approaches to child rearing and helping children grow into mensches. And so it feels really good to be able to connect the scholarly and the personal and the human. So the idea of world making, I think, really comes into relief as a political project when we contrast it with conventional nation building. So children's literatures in general are often recruited into projects of nation building, of helping to define and to transmit what it means to be American or Israeli or a Soviet citizen, particularly when those identities are new and are developing. And in the case of Yiddish, this is a corpus for children that emerged at a very specific and discrete time. It's not like we have to reach back through the misty, the mists of time to ancient
Back when the earth cooled. Yeah.
Right. There's a very particular moment near the turn of the 20th century when Yiddish cultural leaders and educators start writing for the children of their communities in their mother tongue. And a lot of those leaders were cultural nationalists. They wanted to define something that they thought of as the Yiddish nation, but it wasn't going to be a conventional nation with borders and a military to defend the borders. And so instead of a project of conventional nation building, they instead turned their creativity toward symbolic worlds for children that they could articulate or shape through story, and invite children to inhabit with a sense of dignity and purpose. And that's really the enterprise of Yiddish world making that happens through children's literature.
And I love, and we'll come back to this, but the worlds that they were hoping to build and convey were not all the same world, which I think is a fascinating thing that we can come back to and discuss. But I wanted, it's funny when I write about children's literature, mostly American and not necessarily Jewish children's literature. I've often talked about spinach. that, what we may want the kids to have, and what they want to read are not the same thing. And we sometimes are guilty of giving them spinach, which schools can do, but maybe parents to make a kid love reading, that's not a thing that you need to do. You also have food metaphors. Can you talk about those a little bit?
That's right. I also have I call it the alimentary metaphor, the food metaphor. So this is not mine. I mean, I'm pointing out how frequently it occurs, but in 1900, Reuven Breinen pens an essay in a newspaper called Der Jud called Was sollen unsere Kinder lesen? What should our children read? And he talked about how if something is wrong with a child physically, if they have some sort of indigestion, then we will make any sacrifice necessary to get them medical care. You run to the doctor, you run to the apothecary, and you make sure that you get them the care they need. But we are poisoning our children with bad literature. We're corrupting their souls and giving them spiritual indigestion, and nobody cares. So that's the first Yiddish articulation that I've found of that metaphor. But it was really common both in Yiddish and elsewhere. One of my favorite quotations that I came across when writing the book was from a progressive era public librarian in Boston. So, total English, and I would say even sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cultural context. And she talked about not wanting to give our children that cheap kind of book pastry, which was going to, turn their stomachs. And so I talked about the invention of this literature as an outgrowth of the Jewish Enlightenment, of the Haskalah. And it is a reformist movement. It's a do-gooder movement. It's very, very spinachy in its general orientation toward adults as well.
Or
And so
as you say, kale chips.
right, exactly. And so the task of these authors, when they took their Enlightenment ideals and they turned toward a young audience, was to invent the kale chip. They thought that they were going to take something essentially nutritious and give it like the crunch of plot and the salt of adventure, and they were going to make it into something that was at once palatable and nourishing for children.
Amazing. And you also, when we come to Jewish children's literature in America now, we have specific aims and goals that we want in terms of conveying something about our own identity. And it's interesting that thinking about Yiddish children's literature writers, that so many of them came from a truly secular background. And how do these stories that are so relentlessly secular speak to, the range of Jewish identities and Jewish attitudes towards Jewish practice that we modern day readers have? And how did they speak to them then?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And this is really thinking with and thinking for children and about what children need is really where the rubber kind of meets the road in challenging all kinds of aspects of identity, but certainly secular identity, because we have to remember how quickly the historical process of secularization came about within Eastern European Jewish communities. It was often within a single generation, particularly between, say, 1850, 1860, and a little before World War II, the interwar period, maybe. We often have someone going from a completely traditional, observant upbringing to a completely secular adult identity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the holders of that secular identity wanted their Jewishness to disappear. They were not necessarily in favor of a complete deracination. And so then the educational challenge became, how do I get my kids to end up holding the same tensions that I hold between a very traditional set of beliefs and practices on one hand and an open vista of individuality, of defining myself as an individual and not just as part of a group from whom certain things are expected, a kind of open vista for intellectual exploration, if not an open vista for behavioral exploration, right? That there should still be some ethical guardrails limiting my behavior, but they're not going to come from a sense of what Jewish law would dictate. And it's a really interesting challenge to figure out how you get someone to be in a different generation, a future generation, hurtling toward the future, but also to be more or less like me, the parent or the educator. So one of the implicit theories about how to address this challenge at the time was the idea of recapitulation, that the child as an individual needs to recapitulate in their own consciousness, in their own experience, in their own education, everything that has happened to the civilization at large. So if you think that the civilization at large moved from a kind of narrow, constricted religiosity to an open vista of secular freedom, then the movement that you're trying, the journey that you're trying to bring about through a child's education should recapitulate that cultural journey. And so we see, we see efforts to try to make that happen. But as you can imagine, this is a process whose outcome is very difficult to control.
Yeah. And it's world making again.
Right.
And what? It's interesting that Yiddish is a language with so much ambivalence about it from both speakers and non-speakers of it, as well as, passionate love and adoration. What did you learn about the American Jewish community's feelings about Yiddish as a language while writing this book?
So I would say that one of the most surprising realizations I had while writing was the inextricability of Yiddish from shame. First, there was the shame of too much Yiddish. Yiddish had many names for itself, including the mother tongue, Mamaloshen, and jargon. So I mentioned this essay from 1900 about what should our children read. The completely neutral way that Breinen referred to the Yiddish language in this Yiddish article was jargon. He didn't use the term Yiddish, a jargon, right? That it was not a pure language in the way that German or Chinese or Spanish were pure languages, because it was a fusion, it was a hybrid, and so that bespoke impurity. So first there was the shame of too much Yiddish and the nature of what Yiddish was. And then very rapidly, as rapid as American linguistic assimilation into English, which happened, again, we're talking about processes that take a single generation, right?
Crazy.
Then there was the shame and the anxiety of language loss, not right away, but for the next generation. If I had a nickel for every time someone comes up to me after a talk and says, oh, Yiddish was the language that my parents or my grandparents used to keep secrets from us kids, I would be able to fund the animations that I dream of and the adaptations that I dream of for some of these fantastic Yiddish children's stories and intellectual properties, right? But there's so much anxiety about what's been lost. And what I realized about Yiddish children's literature as a project is that it was this multi-continental, multi political, multi-political affiliation, shared effort to replace that shame with a sense of dignity so that the child who read Yiddish could say, oh, these stories, these are mine, right? This is a way that I can understand where I come from and be amused and delighted, and I can learn something. And the adults can say, you're becoming a mensch by reading these stories. This is something that we can really feel good about and kind of push away some of that shame.
Right. I'm going to divert from the questions that I had set up to ask to say, wait, animations? Tell me three that you would think would make amazing, Pixar movies
Sure.
from this book.
Well, so in 2021,
and we'll come back and talk in more detail when we talk
is a
about
sidebar.
Yep,
Great.
sidebar.
All right. So in 2021, Theater Emery released a puppet film called Lobzik, Tales of a Clever Pup, on a shoestring budget, but it was so cleverly done that some people mistake it for animation. And I think that that material could and should be visited at a slightly higher production value, point on the budgetary scale. The Lobzik stories, which are these delightful tales about a kind of leftist lassie, a mutt who gets adopted by a very loving working class family living in the Bronx through the worst of the Great Depression. And they go on anti-authoritarian, pro-democratic adventures together, and they're fun and delightful and hilarious, and also written with a lot of psychological acuity and insight, and they're just delightful. So I feel like Lobzik deserves a bigger, fuller life. That one for sure. Kadia Molodowski has some wonderful children's stories. I would single out The Baker and the Beggar, a story about traditional tzedakah, charitable giving, and how it is actually when we give tzedakah, we are prepaying a debt that we might not know yet exists or will exist someday. And oh boy, just for the pure like animation delight, maybe one of the stories by Moshe Shifres in his collection about the canary bird and other stories. And I'm going to be sneaky and name two. There is the story of the chickens who wanted to learn Yiddish because they realized that they belong to a Jewish farmer and they are Jewish chickens, and
Sure.
they want to learn Yiddish. Or the little boy who realizes the night before school is due to start that he hasn't practiced any Yiddish reading all summer, and he has a nightmare in which the letters fly out of the Yiddish book and begin to attack him bodily using their distinctive physical features as letters according to their shape. So the final nun spears him repeatedly with its pointy, sharp tail, that sort of thing. Oh, and sorry, I gotta say, Sprinze,
Yeah.
I can't leave behind. If we're talking animation, we gotta have Sprinze. So this is the heroine of the eponymous An Unusual Girl from Brooklyn. And the thing about Sprinze is that she is such a, oh boy, she's just such a devoted reader, like a deep reader, that whatever is happening in the book that she happens to have open before her at that moment, she perceives to be happening in the real world. So the book very quickly becomes almost psychedelic in our reading about this fictional character and her real world, who's reading about fictional characters,
Amazing.
kind of infinite refraction. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so from the deliciously ridiculous to the terrifyingly sublime, We are right now, barely 3 generations out from both the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel. And like, how do these humongous seismic things, how do we see them reflected in the literature that you talk about?
So it's really important to note that the mechanism by which this literature was written, published, and disseminated had to do with political ideology and affiliated organizations. So these were fraternal organizations that sponsored schools. In Europe, they were full day schools. In the Americas, they became supplementals after schools. They had publishing houses affiliated with them, and those publishing houses eventually had children's imprints. And so that's how this literature propagates. So when you are confronted with events like the horrors that come to be known collectively as the Holocaust, or when you're confronted with something as momentous as the founding of the State of Israel, everyone is bringing to it their kind of pre-existing political framework and intuitions that help them to make sense of the new events. So there is a variety. It's not all one monolithic response, even across this broad Yiddish-speaking secular left, which is how all of these subgroups kind of affiliated. That's the large umbrella under which they fit themselves. But there were certain principles observed across a wide swath of these groups. So, in speaking about the Holocaust, there were some texts that were very direct in depicting the events, even for elementary aged readers, while others were more indirect and went to earlier moments in Jewish history of the threat of violence and, anti-Semitic violence, specifically like the Spanish Inquisition, with a kind of implicit message of resilience, of the community having survived earlier horrors and therefore having the resources to survive and regroup after this one. There was a figure named Udel who was, oh my gosh, what wasn't he? He was a grammarian and he was a children's author and he taught in Yiddish schools, and he was also an educational theorist who was the kind of animating force behind a pedagogical bulletin, a pedagogical publication where he talked about how the Yiddish schools should operate, particularly those associated with the workmen's circle, the Bundist socialists. And he said, we may have sinned against child psychology in being so frank with our pupils about the events of the war as they were happening in real time, but these were their cousins, sometimes their literal cousins,
Yeah.
who were being decimated in Europe. And we did not feel that we could spare them the knowledge. And so he emphasized giving children stories with agency, including the agency and heroism of children able to do heroic things. And stories that would point the way to some kind of hope. It was sort of like an early articulation of the look for the helpers ethos, Mr. Rogers. And children were generally depicted, even when they were depicted as being very close to or implicated in acts of violence, including the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, children were depicted in non-combatant supporting roles. No one wanted to paint a portrait of a child, picking up a gun. But a child would pick up a book and race around with the last remaining volume of Shalom Aleichem and share those stories to strengthen the children of the ghetto, and to kind of resist in that way.
Let's also be sure we talk about gender, which was my favorite aspect, as somebody who has read about sort of early American and British children's literature, which are so boy focused. I would love to hear you talk about the different messages and different portrayals of gender we see in Yiddish children's literature.
So one of the most significant innovations that comes about through secularist Yiddish schooling is coeducation. And when girls are right there in the classroom, we can't keep ignoring their experiences or kind of pushing them to the side as only supporting characters. We start to see the advent of female main characters. And when we look at a lot of these, at, dozens and dozens of these girl stories, as I have, we see the emergence of what I like to call the Yiddish new girl. So this is the granddaughter, or in some cases, the great granddaughter of the American new woman who comes to prominence in the 1890s, riding her bicycle, wearing bloomers so that she can ride that bicycle with a modicum of modesty, getting an education, including a higher education at one of the Seven Sisters colleges, right? If the family is elite enough to be able to tap into that. So the Yiddish organizations who are promulgating this literature want to take those ideals and democratize them and make them available to the daughters of the working class. So when we see the emergence of this fictional new girl, the single most common plot line in which she is involved is that our heroine is not where her adults expect her to be at any given time. So she may be lost and it might be a crisis, or she might be wandering off on an adventure, but they collectively, the authors of these girl stories, whether they were male or female, imagined a world in which it was safe for girls to wander and venture forth and then be able to return home none the worse for the wear.
Will you just tell those of us who were lucky enough to see you at the Grolier Club earlier, you talked about the mailbox story. And I would love to hear you just go into that in a little more detail here, because that was just the most fascinating anecdote. And I loved it in the book as well.
Sure. So this reads like a little cream puff of a story, like a book pastry, if there ever was one. This is by a Yiddish author who relocated to Argentina and published in Buenos Aires and styled himself Lit Man, literatur man, so literature man. And it's called The Girl in the Mailbox. And if you want to read the original story, I've included it in my anthology, Honey on the Page. And it's about a kind of absent-minded dad who takes his little girl along in Buenos Aires to mail a letter. But oh my gosh, instead of chucking the letter into the mailbox, he chucks in his daughter. So she's sitting there in the mailbox until the mailman comes and collects all the mail. And he's not very bright, so he takes her to the mail facility. And all of the letters and the packages start volunteering. Ooh, I have a little bit of extra postage. I could chip in my extra postage. And so they take up this collection and they realize they have enough to mail the little girl, to have the little girl accompany them in the mail to Poland. And so she goes on this wonderful merry adventure on the high seas. They go on the boat to Poland, and then all of the letters and parcels have addresses written on them. And so they all get sent off to their final destination in Poland, but she doesn't have an address. So she gets brought back to Buenos Aires, and then they come to the town square and someone says, "A little girl newly arrived from Poland, anyone want to buy her?" And the dad comes along and says, "How much? 5 groschen? Here, take 10." And he goes off arm in arm with his daughter. No problem. Delightful story, right?
Right.
Unless you know the history of how Jewish girls and women moved between Poland and Buenos Aires at this time. There was an immense smuggling and human trafficking operation known typically as the white slave trade that brought poor Jewish girls, teenagers, very young women to work as prostitutes in Buenos Aires, in Brazil, in nearby locations in Latin America. And, you know, the story, and now I'm not saying we have to know that history in order to derive meaning from the story. A lot of these stories are bisemic, meaning that they express meaning on a couple of different levels. But I think that if we do know that history, the story speaks on a special frequency that we're able to hear because it is a really radical reimagining. It's an act of kind of almost aggressive world making, of shaping an imagined world to be safe in ways that the real world is not. And so I think that it has a kind of a depth and a resonance to it if we do read against that backdrop.
And I think perhaps the greatest children's literature is able to express, able to work for the adult who is sharing it with the child as well as the child experience it. I think there's a reason why Where the Wild Things Are is one of the most, eternal classics of literatures. You have these terrifying monsters, you have this conflict with the mother, and you have returning, and his dinner was still hot. And I think that that's a lot of, yeah.
Can I say something about what I think of as the Yiddish Where the
Go.
Wild Things Are?
Yeah.
Because there is such a story, and I write about it in the book by Meisha Kulbach, The Wind That Got Angry. This is a story about a wind whose very existence is compromised by the early arrival of spring in the city. It gets warm too quickly, and this is a mortal threat to the wind, who is exhausted and just wants to find a cold enough, calm enough place that he can rest. And rest, that place of refuge is denied to him again and again. And he gets so frustrated that he finally goes out in the field and he girds his loins, which is as absurd sounding in the Yiddish as it is in the English, and he whirls himself into this blinding, terrible blizzard, and he just kind of rages it out. And I think until a single mom home alone with two kids comes out to beg him repeatedly for the sake of the children to calm down, and he finally does. And I think that this story is an allegory for a child's tantrum weather system that just blows in and has to kind of spend itself and rage until it does so. And I think that it's a story for children about emotional self-regulation, much as Sendak is writing in Where the Wild Things Are. And I think it's also a story for caregivers that says to the caregivers, hey, I see you. Sometimes it's just a weather system.
And unfortunately now with climate change, the wind not getting yeah. Anyway,
Right.
So I see that there's a question in the chat that in the Q&A that I was also going to ask you. Sonia asks about you've talked about how Yiddish writers wrote about the Holocaust for children. Can you tell us if and how writers during and after the Holocaust presented young readers with the destroyed pre-war Yiddish civilization?
Sure. So there is a fair amount of nostalgia, as you might imagine. Writers in New York writing about Eastern European childhood. To me, one of the most notable examples is also one of the latest, published in the 1970s. Kadia Molodovsky writes a series of cheder maises, stories about the cheder, or informal Jewish elementary school that was attended almost exclusively by boys. So she imagines herself into a space that she wouldn't really have had access to, and doesn't write about the events of the war directly, but just presents to us some of the kind of thick, rich folklore of Jewish childhood. So the boys who know that on the night of Hoshana Rabbah, they get to make a wish. And so they go out to intercept Elijah's star-wheeled chariot as it moves across the sky so that they can make their wish. And then at the decisive moment, when the window is open and you could make the wish, they get distracted by one of them having to say a cute little rhyme that he thinks of, and he distracts them at the key moment, right? And so the wish is always being deferred. So it is a psychologically relatable evergreen story, but in this very specific cultural context. And then another thing that we see throughout the 50s is a lot of holiday tales and trying to, what I would think of as, reinsert the Jewish child into the Jewish eternal after this really intrusive set of historical circumstances that kind of rip them out of Jewish cyclical time. All right, we're going to bring Jewish cyclical time back, and we're going to tell stories that are suitable for children growing up in secular families that are nevertheless going to acquaint them with the themes and the motifs associated with each holiday. So this is something that Sina Rabinovich does beautifully in a collection called Der Lieber Yontif, Our Precious Holidays.
Yeah. Another thing that comes up in the book repeatedly is wealth disparity and the need to address that. That's a theme that runs through grown up and kidlit in Yiddish literature. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if I had to point to one most common theme across this whole literature, which consists of several decades worth of periodicals and almost 1,000 standalone books, ranging from little skinny picture books and chapbooks to thick anthologies, it would be the fact that some people have more, other people have less, and everyone has an obligation to do something to rectify this gap. And the ideas about what to do are one of the places where we really see the expression of that variety of political intuitions. So if you put the emphasis on traditional charity, that's a very different message than the stories that talk about how to collectively organize and take a labor action the way the free forest-dwelling birds do when they strike on behalf of the city-dwelling birds who are trapped in cages, or the story of a boy who comes to understand first very gradually and then kind of overwhelmingly and all together that as a child of the bourgeoisie, there's a whole multi-species order that has been arranged for his well-being, comfort, thriving, but that everyone else is making sacrifices, from the washwoman who goes around in rags herself to the donkey that's provided the leather for his shoes, to the calf that can't have access to mother's milk because they've siphoned off the calf's mother's milk for him to drink. And all of a sudden, it comes crashing in on him that there's this whole world order for his benefit, and it's not really fair. And he asks his mother, like, how can this be? What are we supposed to do about this? And she says, she's tired, she's been momming all day. She doesn't know what to do. And so you know what he does? He writes down his question in a notebook and he says, when I grow up, I'm going to figure out the answer. And that's how that story ends.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and also when you talk about the the wild bird, the chickens organizing for the caged birds, it reminded me of a sort of modern American classic, Click Clack Moo, Cows That Type, which is where the whole barnyard organizes for collectively to make life better for them, and it actually works. It ends up being good for the farmer as well. And that seems such a singular story for this point in time, and yet I think a lot of the people who love it don't necessarily get how perhaps subversive for the time we're living in it is. And that brings me to a question about how Yiddish literature can be helpful for democracy education today. We are living in an absolutely unprecedented time of book banning and book challenges. Can we talk about how children's literature can make us I mean, I realize how elevated and highfalutin this sounds, but how can it make us, make a better world?
No, that's exactly right. And the book that I'm working on now is about exactly that. It kind of draws on the expertise in Yiddish children's literature specifically, but makes the frame much wider to how the reading experiences that we share with children can foster democratic habits of mind. And Yiddish children's literature is a great place to start because it embeds a really sophisticated mechanics of empathy, of teaching children from the youngest ages, from the most basic building blocks, to imagine what it would feel like to be in someone else's situation. So that starts with things as simple as the defamiliarization effect of making the tired wind into our protagonist. Because everyone knows that the arrival of spring and the arrival of warmth is a good thing, right? That's a universally held desire. But this story says, not so fast, kids. Instead of reflexively identifying with the forces of spring and warmth, step into the wind's perspective for a moment and imagine what it's like to have this be an existential threat, right? Go to the most vulnerable entity that you can imagine and think about it from their perspective. So what I see in Yiddish children's literature, from nursery rhymes, like a nursery rhyme where Ida Maza imagined what it was like to be the 4-year-old who's been shut out of playing with the 8-year-old and wonders, what if the tables were turned? What if you were the big kid and I was the little kid? Then would you play with me? And it scales up all the way through the teenage years in asking children to imagine what it would be like to inhabit a different perspective. And I think that this kind of gradual building of the skills and the habits and the muscles of empathy is going to be critical to reconstituting some sort of a shared democratic life. That's one thing. And then the other important idea that I think is embedded in this literature, I talk in chapter 5 about the Miriam Sanatorium, which was an institution founded by the Bundist socialists in Warsaw. It was established as an institution for preventing tuberculosis, but it was run as a children's republic where children engaged in shared governance. They voted on everything. One of the sanatoristen recalls, we voted on everything, including whether to have spinach with dinner. So there's spinach again, just as a leitmotif running through the hour. And they were on committees and they shared responsibility and they shared decision making. And the work of the sanatorium, the preventorium, the democratic decision making was overlaid with the work of nature education. And that's where the children's literature comes out of in this experiment, because the nature teacher, Yisrael Bieber, wrote 2 volumes of kind of lightly fictionalized, you are there, spring in the forest and winter in the forest, of what it was like to spend time at the Miriam Sanatorium. And the way that he wrote about nature really shows that they were using the natural world to educate children about what it meant to be a mensch. So there's a lot of depiction of predation, scenes of predation, and a real directive to kids to intervene on behalf of the underdog species. Now, some of this wouldn't go over so well with contemporary ideas about the human in relation to the rest of the natural world, right? Or the interfering with nature and the imagining of predators and predation as bad, right? These things wouldn't pass muster necessarily with David Attenborough or more contemporary ideas. But this is a bad time to get at your computer is about to restart, but hopefully I snoozed that for long enough. But it gives us a window into how they were thinking and teaching children about being solicitous toward the most vulnerable members of society.
Wow, great answer. And I think there are a couple more questions that we'll take, but before we get there, I do think we have to say, what is the state of Yiddish literature, Yiddish Kidlit today? Is it still being produced? If so, where? And for whomst, as my children would say. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So I talk about this in the afterword to the book, Hasidic herring and Swedish fish, because there are really two places where Yiddish children's literature is still being produced. The kind of smaller scale one is in the country of Sweden. Marjorie, I know you wrote about this years ago. Yiddish is one of 5 official languages in Sweden that receive some measure of government support, and there is a publishing house called Olniansky Text that sells its books over Etsy. That's where you can buy them in the United States. And they publish a range of new and translated and retranslated stories in Yiddish. And then in the Hasidic world, there are still stories, graphic novels being produced, but not in isolation. They are really part of kind of modern multimedia empires that involve toys and games and kind of commodity worlds that children can inhabit. And they are different in some ways from the literature that I write about. To me, one of the most notable differences is that there's a real emphasis on very bifurcated, differentiated roles for boys and girls. But they are absolutely in the spirit of handing children a robust childhood in Yiddish.
Yeah. And a final question before we hit these 2 remaining questions in the Q&A. Where do you want both research and the literature itself to go? Where do we go from here? What would you like to see? What are some rich areas of study that you think are still underexplored? Take it away.
Sure. So we are in such early days of what I hope might be a little bit of a juvenile turn in Jewish literary studies and cultural studies, where hopefully people will think about children's literature critically alongside other literature and cultural productions. I hope that this book shows that these texts reward close, critical, thoughtful attention. That's in the scholarly realm. I think that these works can also seed, SEED, new cultural production. I think that there's adaptation. I think that these stories can be fodder for contemporary creatives' own work. We've seen a little bit of that with adaptations like Linda Elevitz Marshall's Goodnight Wind. Nancy Chernin has a children's story about the first teddy bear that brings in a lot of Yiddish. And so I hope that in both scholarly and creative realms, people will really kind of take this literature and run with it and do exciting new things.
Yes, there's so often frequently this knee-jerk reaction that children's literature is beneath study. And it is so, A, it's the most important literature there is, and B, it is such a rich way of looking at a culture, and and values and all of that. So thank you so much for this vital work that you have done. And I really can't express how much I love this book and how important it is. And let's see, we have 9 minutes. So let's get to these last remaining questions. Lynn wants to know if are some of these stories in published books which may be available to PJ Library children?
As of yet, PJ has not seen fit to adopt any of these stories or have them adapted, but I think they are ripe for it. I hope it's something that's going to happen. I would love to work and consult with contemporary children's authors, Jewish children's authors,
Right. Or
with some of
perhaps,
the most eligible of these
yes,
stories.
perhaps publishers like Carbon, to like let's have people think about, translation and adaptation.
That's right.
That would be
I
great.
did have a children's publisher say to me very understandably, I'm not in the business of publishing historical artifacts. And I get that. But what
Sure.
I would say is that the more we run the risk of the 2020s and 2030s looking like the 1930s, the more urgent these texts and the lessons that they have to teach are for us, and the less they look like just historical artifacts.
Also, if you actually look at the stories as you do, they are not these, ossified in amber things. They are so relevant to now, but they're also great stories that put that, as you say, they're about kids' emotions, they are about adventures. And I think a lot of times people who are saying, oh, this is just history, aren't looking at the stories that they're
We did
coming.
talk about writing literature, literary criticism from within, from the inside of the stories. I've gotten inside so many of these stories through the work of translation. And
Yes.
once we get inside of them, we see that they're really vibrant and dynamic and they're not ossified.
Yes, perfectly said. And here is a completely rando fascinating question. Is the white slave trade the reason the Yiddish word for pimp is Alphonse, i.e. a Yiddishized version of a Spanish name? Do you know the answer to that question?
There are other people who could say it more with greater authority than I could, but my understanding is that the etymology is something like that. Yeah,
That's
along those
fascinating.
lines. And maybe Miriam Udel, who's written about white slave trade, would be able to tell us more conclusively.
Fascinating. Since we do have a second here, I think people do like to know about, the big names, the big male names who have written, uh, people that perhaps don't know that they have written Yiddish Kidlit. Can you talk briefly about those? And yeah.
Sure. So, you know what? I'm going to mention a big male name that we all know, Isaac Bashevis Singer,
I've
who's
heard of that
written
guy. Yeah.
14 collections of or stories of children's literature. But I'm going to tell you something you might not know, which is how he got into writing for children. It was thanks to a woman in publishing, Elizabeth Shub. She was the daughter of a Yiddish literary and cultural critic and a longtime editor of a children's periodical called the Kinderjournal. He styled himself Shmuel Niger. Many of us refer to him today, as I do in the book, by his birth name, Shmuel Charny. So her father worked in the Yiddish cultural sphere, and Elizabeth Shub was in English language children's publishing. And she said to Isaac Bashevis, who is a family friend, American parents buy their children a lot of books. I think that if you started writing for children, you could make a mint. And he said, well, I didn't really grow up with children's literature. I grew up reading Bible stories and medrash, rabbinic interpretations of biblical stories, but I'll try something. So he went off and he wrote this narrative in rhyming couplets that was completely stilted and terrible. And he brought it to her, and she said, this isn't going to work for an American market. Go try again. So he back to the drawing board, he racked his brain, and he came up with Zlata the goat. And he cracked the code. And once he understood the tone, the kind of plot, the kind of texture, he went back and did it again and again and again and again, very skillfully. And he said in an interview later, he told this story, and he said, so now every time someone buys one of my books, I get a check and she gets a check, and everyone's happy.
Funny. So getting back to the question about PJ Library stuff,
Yeah.
even though you don't have, I mean, one useful thing that people can do is they can go to Honey on the Page and share the stories that are in there in a storytelling way with their kids, even if there aren't the pictures. I think people sometimes, not saying the questioner was saying this, but that people sometimes forget that children's literature is a conversation between a child and a grown-up. And
Yes.
when you're sitting with that book, it's not just about what's on the page. It's about how you are talking about your reactions, the kids' reactions. How does this relate to the life that we have? The relate. Have you seen this kind of, bully? There's the Simchat Torah bullying story in,
Flag.
what would you do in this circumstance? Do you know kids who do that kind of thing? So if you want those kinds of stories and you're not seeing them in your kidlit now, you can go to Honey on the Page and do it as a storytelling event with your grandkid or kid.
That's a great point. It is such a gift to share a story, and as parents, we tend to back off once children achieve independent literacy and decoding skills, and that's a real missed opportunity. We can stay in conversation about stories. We can even model for them how we engage in critical conversation about stories that seem too young for them.
Yes. Yes.
And I just want to say, going back to what we were talking about a moment ago about the value of this literature, if I had to boil it down to the bumper sticker, it would be, if you care about the future, you care about children's literature.
Amen to that. I think, we have a minute to go, but I think that is, I can't think of a better ending than that if we want to, especially since we have no more open questions. Alex or Julia, do you want to come back and
Yes, well, this was a wonderful chat. Thank you so much to both of you. And Miriam, congratulations again on the wonderful new book. Both this book and also Honey on the Page are available from the YIVO store. We'll drop a link in the chat about that. But you should rush to the YIVO shop to get a copy and share it with your children and take all of these lessons to your local PJ Library representative so that we can all get more of these books. But yes, congratulations and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Thank
And thank you,
you.
Marjorie.